The Polish-Lithuanian Army of the Great Northern War. The Polish-Lithuanian State in 1700. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been a very powerful state throughout the 17th century. Its army had certainly been the largest and most powerful in Eastern Europe. The position of strength can be argued to have died with the death of John III Sobieski in 1697. The election of the Saxon elector Augustus as King Augustus II of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth brought a great deal of division and infighting throughout the Commonwealth, coming very close to breaking point. Augustus II had led the Commonwealth alongside his Saxon forces and other imperial forces in a largely ineffective war against the Ottoman Empire on the Danube. Seeking a way to bolster support for his crown, he turned his attention north, seeking to annex Livonia, establish trade on the Baltic, and an alliance with Denmark. These plans were an obvious threat to Sweden, leading King Karl XII to conclude Augustus must be removed from the throne. Despite past conflicts, such as the Deluge War, 1655 to 1660, the Polish-Lithuanian nobility had little argument with Sweden, yet their king Augustus II would drag them and their military with him to war, a war that would devastate their land and lead to civil war in their nation. The peace treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 saw a great reduction in the once powerful army, right before the onset of the Great Northern War in 1700. Recruitment in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Many aspects of the military retained a distinctly Renaissance character by the start of the 18th century. Since the reign of King Władysław IV, the military was split into two separate contingents: a national contingent that consisted of winged hussars, panzerni, light cavalry, and Polish-Hungarian-style infantry. The second contingent was a foreign contingent that consisted of German infantry, dragoons, and heavy cavalry. The regular army could be strengthened by the raising of new units in wartime, as well as by private troops raised by nobles, the militia of larger cities, and by a levy of nobility called up by royal decree. Units in the national contingent were recruited in the traditional Polish manner. A rotamaster of a banner would receive a recruitment letter from the king. A banner was roughly equivalent to a Western military company, and a rotamaster commanded it in a similar style to a Western colonel. The rotamaster would then recruit companions, who would make up the core of the banner. Each companion would bring his retainers with him. 1 or 2 retainers were typical. The rotamaster would then appoint a lieutenant and a standard-bearer from the companions. In this period, it was not uncommon for the rotamaster himself to be absent from the banner, with a lieutenant or a chosen companion being appointed to lead the unit. The retinue of the rotamaster would be part of the unit and was often the largest single component, being around 12 men on average. There was room for corruption with the system. This was done through blind portions, who would receive dead pays. This would see a rotamaster or lieutenant's retinue claiming more troops on paper than they in reality possessed. The money that would be used to pay for these troops would instead be kept by the rotamaster and the lieutenant. This created an incentive to not bring too large a retinue in order to maximize profits from the dead pay. There would often be a 5 to 10% difference between a unit's paper strength and its real strength as a result. A further problem to sustaining unit strength was that companions would often leave during campaign, and especially in winter camps, sometimes bringing their retinues with them. During the Great Northern War, it was not too rare to see a banner that on paper has a strength of 100 men being able to field only 30 to 40. The recruited companions would have to provide for their retinue, such as war horses, ammunition, weapons, clothing, food, horse fodder, tools, and kitchen equipment and such. They would also provide servants to cook, gather or buy food, and guard the stores. Naturally, to carry all these, wagons were required. So each companion would provide at least one large, open-topped wooden wagon with wicker inserts. Sometimes more were brought, and some companions would bring a personal wagon to drive in. Designed more for comfort, officers would also bring a larger, fully covered wagon for their banner to store weather-sensitive supplies. This could often lead to a long, poorly organized wagon train and lots of servants being required to drive these wagons. The foreign contingents were recruited in the familiar Western style. A colonel would sign a contract to raise a regiment with the king. The colonel would then recruit officers, each to recruit a company in their region within a specified time frame. This system was also prone to exploitation through dead pay. Recruitment officers and colonels would sometimes claim money for soldiers that existed only on paper, pocketing the rest for themselves. During the late 1600s, it was not rare for wealthy nobles who held the rank of colonel to use foreign regiments to make as much money from the state as possible, keeping their regiments as small as possible. This would go as far as some nobles dressing servants as soldiers when being inspected, so it appeared the regiment was up to strength. As an example, Field Hetman Zajnowski's regiment of foot in 1702 had a paper strength warranting a pay for 600 men. They could only bring 405 to muster, meaning the officers were taking the money. It is possible that not all of these 405 were real soldiers. This was happening under the command of the then second most important general of the Polish army. Winged Hussars. The Heavy Hussars, also known as the Winged Hussars, were a prominent and the most prestigious arm of the army. They were often young nobles who could afford the formidable array of armour and weapons required for themselves and their retinue. The primary armament for a Heavy Hussar was a kopia lance, which would be around 5 meters long. They were also equipped with estocks, or a cruciform hilted-back sword. Cavalry maces and picks remained very popular weapons also. Every hussar would carry a sabre. Both hussar companions and their retainers would also carry a brace of pistols. 2 was the norm, but some brought more. The retainers would no longer carry the kopia lance by the Great Northern War, instead carrying a short-barreled musket called a musketoon, or simply a carbine. All hussars were armoured. They wore a unique mix of plate and chainmail called karatsyna. Lobster-tailed pot helmets were also worn. A companion's armour was often very richly decorated and ornate, showing off their owner's wealth, pride, and prowess. The armour of the retainers was often much simpler and less decorated. The question as to whether the Heavy Hussars wore their wings into battle is a difficult one. It is possible they did, equally possible they did not. It may even be the case that some went into battle with wings and others used them only for ceremony. The famous wings were very ornate and iconic to the Heavy Hussars of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, having been made especially famous in the relief of Vienna during the siege of 1683. The Hussars were heavy shock cavalry, relying on their lances and heavy armour to carry them through an initial great shock attack and then finish their enemy off with their vast array of weaponry. The Polish Crown Army and the Lithuanian Army both had their own separate banners of hussars. In 1702, Poland could field 22 banners with a total strength of around 1,600 hussars. The Lithuanian Army in 1702 could field 4 banners totaling around 400 hussars. The number of hussars the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth could field dropped dramatically through the 1600s. Due to losses against the Russians, Tatars, Cossacks, and Swedes in various wars and conflicts, combined with the increasing cost to equip and field heavy hussar banners, their numbers decreased. This strain was made greater by near constant conflict with the Ottoman Empire to the south, requiring the Commonwealth to rely more on other types of cavalry, something King Jan Sobieski put great emphasis on during his rule in the late 1600s. Pancerni. The Pancerni cavalry, also known by the older name Cossack-style cavalry, were the most numerous cavalry in the whole army, and the most numerous troop type in the national contingents. The Pancerni were a second in prestige only to the Winged Hussars. The Pancerni originated as Renaissance-era missile cavalry. However, in the 1660s, in response to a lack of heavy hussars and the necessities of ongoing warfare on the southern border, the Pancerni were adapted to an all-purpose cavalry unit. They were designed to be able to take on all of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's foes, and thus had to be capable in set-piece battle and shock actions, as well as rapid pursuits and skirmishing. When commanded by skilled, creative, and imaginative leaders, they saw great success in all these types of warfare. The Pancerni wore traditional chainmail, very distinctive of the Pancerni, though some officers would also wear plate or scale armour. There were also Pancerni who would not wear any armour at all, so the Pancerni banners would show a wide variety of armour in one unit. Steel arm guards were commonly worn. These could be richly decorated for companions, or left plain for the retinue. The weaponry of the Pancerni consisted of a lighter and shorter lance than the hussar lance, being around 2 meters long, to allow for shock cavalry tactics on the battlefield. The lancers were introduced in 1676 and became a required weapon for Panzerni banners. These shorter lancers were issued by the state, and as the war went on, they would have a shortage reaching the banners. Some Lithuanian cavalry would instead use a much longer lance, closer to that used by the hussars, being around 4.17 meters in length. A round eastern shield was a very common addition. These were around 58 to 70 centimeters in diameter and made of wood. Companions would often have a richly bejeweled and decorated one for parade and a much simplified war shield. A variety of hand weapons were also used, including the universal sabres, as well as horsemen's picks, maces, broadswords, and occasionally estocks, which could pierce through the gaps in armour. Bows had long been a traditional weapon for the Panzerni, but by the Great Northern War, bows were taken more as a matter of personal taste rather than standard weaponry, though many Panzernis still brought them. Firearms were an essential part of the Panzerni's weaponry. They were required to possess a wheel-lock or flintlock musketoon or carbine. They were to be 12 mm in caliber and 80 to 90 centimeters long. 2 wheel-lock pistols were also a requirement, though more could be brought or flintlocks used as well. Wealthier companions were more likely to have these more modern flintlocks, while some retainers may have had a much older snap chase model. Later, in the Great Northern War, from 1711 to 1716, the number of firearms available to the Panzerni, alongside Commonwealth forces in general, was drastically reduced. This was due to a combination of a lack of imports and a collapse in domestic firearms production. A large warhammer, a long staff with a small spiked steel or iron head, was often used by officers as a symbol of rank and prestige. A ceremonial war mace was also popular amongst senior officers and command staff. These maces were very ornate, bejeweled, and gilded. The battlefield tactic of the Panzerni was to form a two-deep line. The better-equipped companions would form the front line with short lances, and the lesser-equipped retinue with firearms in a rear rank. It was becoming increasingly common at the time for companions to not join their banners in the field, but instead supply another retinue man who had been better equipped. Many companions who joined their banner in the field looked down on this practice. Tactically, the Panzerni were also used for reconnaissance, skirmishing, providing a covering force, relief missions, short charges to test an enemy's resolve and strength, as well as pursuing a broken enemy or providing a rearguard during a retreat. The Panzerni saw a great deal of action throughout the Great Northern War, fighting the Swedish, as well as each other, Saxons and Cossacks. In 1702, the Polish army had 79 banners, consisting of around 4,920 men. The Lithuanian army could field in 1702 28 banners of around 2,600 men. Light cavalry. The light cavalry of the national contingent consisted of a mix of Tatar and Wallachian cavalry. These troops were unarmoured and lightly equipped. The weapons they did use consisted of bows, carbines, musketoons, pistols, and sabres. Sometimes they were equipped with a light spear. The Polish army in 1702 had 13 banners, making up around 710 men. The Lithuanian army could field 10 banners, making up around 1,000 men. This was more men despite less banners than the Polish army, as the Polish army banners could vary between 40 to 100 men, whilst the Lithuanian light cavalry banners were normally around 100 men each. Most Polish light cavalry were Wallachians, whilst Lithuanian light cavalry were mostly Cossacks. The light cavalry would be frequently used for intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, foraging, and light harassing raids. Polish-Hungarian infantry. The Polish-Hungarian infantry, called Haiduks, formed a very small part of the Polish-Lithuanian army. They were generally used as bodyguard units for important headmen. They were equipped with muskets and sabres. In 1702, the Polish army could field around 470 Haiduks, performing guard duties for various headmen. The Lithuanian army could field around 700 split between 5 banners in 1698, but I have been unable to find figures for 1702. Foreign infantry. The foreign infantry, also known as the German infantry, were recruited almost entirely from within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Only a small percentage of NCOs and officers were actual foreigners. These regiments were recruited as part of the foreign contingent and were recruited through enlistment. At the end of the 1600s, many of these regiments were still equipped with matchlocks and large-bladed axes that would be used both as two-handed weapons and a fork to rest the matchlock on. Gradually, these weapons would be replaced with flintlock muskets, the axes being dispensed with. A small percentage of troops in the banner would be equipped with pikes. All soldiers would have a small sword of some description, however standardization was often not achieved. These troops were able to form a more modern battle line, capable of attack and defense in the field, though often these units were poorly organized and undermanned. Individually brave, many of the soldiers had little motivation to fight a fight they didn't see as theirs. Also, problems with pay led to a further lowering of morale. The Polish army could field 25 regiments in 1702. These regiments were made up from around 7,040 men. Individual regiments could vary from between 100 to 800 men. The Lithuanian army could field 6 regiments made up from around 2,000 men. Regiments varied in size from 200 to 600 men each. Dragoons. Dragoons in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were used very much in the traditional way in the Great Northern War. They were used as mounted infantry and would almost always fight on foot. They were a part of the foreign contingents and were recruited through enlistment. The dragoons were equipped with matchlock muskets as their primary weapon. They were also equipped with sabres and often small axes. Pistols were unpopular due to their extra cost, so they were seldom used. Some dragoons preferred wheel-lock muskets, and as the war progressed, flintlock muskets became increasingly common. The Polish army in 1702 could field 3 regiments of dragoons and 3 independent companies. These amounted to 2,500 dragoons in total. The Lithuanian army could field 11 companies of dragoons, each around 100 strong, making 1,100 dragoons. Heavy Cavalry. The Heavy Cavalry of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were an enlisted part of the foreign contingent, equipped and organized largely like Western Heavy Cavalry. Foreign Heavy Cavalry were not popular with a lot of the Polish nobility, however they would see a warmer welcome in Lithuania. The Heavy Cavalry were equipped with swords, carbines, and a pair of pistols. Traditional Polish-Lithuanian armour was not used by these regiments. Some went unarmoured, and others were equipped with Western-style cuirasses, consisting of a front and back plate. The Heavy Cavalry provided the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with an arguably more modern alternative to the Hussars for shock cavalry. Others, particularly in Poland, argued that these cavalrymen often lacked the individual skill and elan of the Hussars. In 1702, the Polish army had on the books 3 regiments and 3 independent companies. These amounted to a total of 900 heavy cavalrymen. The Lithuanian army of 1702 could field 300 strong companies, making for 300 cavalrymen. Royal Guard. At their own expense, the Polish-Lithuanian monarch also had direct command of a royal guard. At the time of Sobieski's death, the Polish-Lithuanian Royal Guard consisted of a Trabant Guard of 150 gentlemen halberdiers, a regiment of King's Heavy Cavalry, 1,000 men strong, the Banner of Court Hussars, consisting of 100 aristocratic young winged hussars, a King's, Queen's, and Prince's Foot Guard, each being a westernized infantry regiment, a King's Dragoon regiment of westernized cavalry, 2 very small corps of Swiss Guards, one for the King and one for the Queen, 2 companies of Hungarian-style infantry, 2 companies of Ottoman janissaries made up from deserters and prisoners. Artillery. The artillery was by far the weakest part of the Polish-Lithuanian army. By 1700, there were somewhere around 2,000 and 3,000 cannons in the Commonwealth. The majority were old and in a state of disrepair. Over half of these pieces were in private hands and scattered across a series of fortresses and towns throughout the Commonwealth. There was no well-organized system in place, as well as grossly inadequate funding to provide horses and equipment for artillery trains. This led to the Polish-Lithuanian army relying on a relatively small amount of light guns in the field, seriously jeopardizing the army's ability to contend in modern battles in which firepower was often key. Flags and banners. Polish-Lithuanian flags were transitioning from the very large flags of the Renaissance era. These flags followed the idea that the bigger the flag, the more important the unit bearing it. Polish units tended to use pennants on lances and flags with a fairly simple design, usually depicting religious patrons and heraldic badges. Many of these had twin-tail designs. In Lithuania, an image of a mounted knight in armor was very common, and the design had dated back for centuries. Poland tended to use the nationalistic white cross and white eagle. Mercenaries and town militias were more likely to issue small flags on a company level, in the Western style. Many flags from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth have been preserved in the Swedish Army Museum in Stockholm. Finances and funding. The finances of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were in a poor state in the early 1700s, which led to a chronic failure to pay soldiers. In late 1702, the Commonwealth was still owing pay to its soldiers dating back to the wars with the Ottoman Empire. This was to the tune of 17,500,000 zloty. The average annual budget was between 10 and 11 million zloty. Being ordered to march to war, in a new war, which many of the Polish and Lithuanians felt wasn't anything to do with them, when the wages from the previous war still hadn't arrived, proved devastating for morale. The severe lack of funding made it impossible to properly feed and supply the army, leading to the requirement for the soldiers to forage supplies and take it from the civilian population. As the vast majority of the fighting was taking place within the Commonwealth for the army, this meant plundering their own citizens. This led to a massive decline in discipline within the ranks, who were forced to effectively survive by their own means by their government. Pay was further hampered by civil war, and the difficulties in getting the government to form diminished the ability to raise taxes. This and the fact that the areas controlled by Sweden and Swedish allies at various points in the war contributed nothing to the army that stayed loyal to Augustus, all served to make the situation worse. Civil War. Going into the Great Northern War, Lithuania was in a state of civil unrest, arguably already civil war. The powerful and wealthy Sofia family found itself in open conflict with the rest of the Lithuanian nobility. Each had their own military forces and used them. The Battle of Ulkainiki on the 18th of September 1700 saw the defeat of the Sofias, who turned to the King Augustus II for support. They offered to send their forces against the Swedes to win royal favour, pushing many Lithuanian nobles to be more sympathetic to Karl XII and the Swedish. Many more sought simply to avoid the conflict altogether. Many nobles felt they had no quarrel with the Swedes, and further resented Augustus II bringing his Saxon forces into the Commonwealth and dragging them into this war, as well as using Polish-Lithuanian state treasury funding to fund the Saxon army. Leading nobles were often in favour of negotiating with Karl XII. Many of these nobles were counting on Augustus losing the war and the crown, as he had been opposed to his contentious rule. When Karl XII placed Stanislaus on the throne in place of Augustus, many of the nobles who had opposed Augustus sided with the new king and his Swedish backers, leading to instances of Polish-Lithuanian troops fighting one another on opposite sides of the field, such as at Kalisz in 1706. This led to further resentment and collapse in morale. Unprepared for war. A number of factors also played into the Commonwealth's poor preparation for war. Augustus II had planned a reduction of the Lithuanian army in 1699. Although this was not fully carried out by 1700 and the onset of war, it still served to destabilize further the Lithuanian army, already fighting amongst itself. Large parts of the Polish army were scattered across the Commonwealth, particularly in the south. Through 1702 to 1704, a significant portion was kept busy dealing with a Cossack uprising in the south and was unable to be used in the north against the Swedes. The rest of the army had often no means of concentrating their forces and were even then left poorly supplied and in poor conditions, falling victim to disease and desertion. The various companions were more and more refusing to serve in their banners, sending only their retinue instead. This deprived the banners of their best equipped men at a time they were sorely needed. Furthermore, the two leading headmen of the army at the outbreak of the war, Grand Hetman Stanislaus Jablonski and Field Hetman Sieniacy Potocki, both died in 1702, leading to something of a leadership vacuum. Performance in battle. Due to the various factors mentioned, the Commonwealth's army was most often forming an auxiliary part of another army, chiefly the Saxons, but sometimes the Swedes. Their cavalry was very effective when used correctly. The tactic of a hussar banner, with 3 panzerny banners supporting left, right, and rear, provided a very powerful formation at times, being able to totally overrun a regiment of Saxon heavy cavalry in one example. Overall, the Polish-Lithuanian army fared very poorly in the Great Northern War. They were routinely defeated in battle by the Swedish army throughout the early years of the war, such as at Klitzau in 1702, and a force of 10,000 Saxon and Polish-Lithuanian cavalry being defeated by a much smaller Swedish force outside Warsaw in 1705. Generally, the Commonwealth army tried to avoid Swedish forces, relying on hit-and-run tactics to harass and damage the Swedes. This was very effective on the small scale, but not enough to influence the war on the grand scale. However, so impressed was Karl XII by these raids that he was very eager to include Polish-Lithuanian cavalry in his own force. Conclusions. The Great Northern War was a tragedy for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It saw the nation go from being a major European power to an auxiliary force attached to other nations' armies. Its land and population had been devastated, and certainly after 1716, it had almost no role to play in the war. The individual Polish warriors, especially the cavalry, proved themselves to be exceptionally skilled and courageous individually. The army as a whole, however, was underpaid, neglected, and undersupplied. It was dragged into war against its will and suffered accordingly. No amount of skill or courage could make up for the terrible state the army was in. The Polish-Lithuanian army was also suffering severe manpower shortages, a combination of previous wars, a lack of desire to fight in this war by the companions, and corruption and inability prevented the army coming up to strength. The army was also outdated, not being able to reform and renovate, despite being formally leading in military achievements and innovations, with many historians crediting the invention of the cartridge box to the Commonwealth. The army was by now unable to compete with modern forces such as the Swedish. Finally, the state of civil war made it impossible for the Commonwealth to rectify any of the problems it faced. Although Karl XII's puppet king Stanislaus would be dethroned, the Commonwealth would remain under Augustus II after the war. His death would lead to more crisis for the Commonwealth in years to come. Ultimately, the fate of the Polish-Lithuanian army was a noble yet doomed affair. Sources: The Great Northern War Compendium, especially the article The Once Proud and Powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Army by Michał Parodowski. The Great Northern War, New Perspectives by the Danish Commission for Military History from the Royal Danish Defence College. Armies of the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1720 by Gabriele Esposito, and Charles XII and the Collapse of the Swedish Empire by R. Nisbet Bein. This was a part of the Armies of the Early 18th Century series by Yet Another History Channel. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope it was of interest to somebody somewhere. If you'd like to support the channel, please do like, comment, and subscribe, and help the channel grow.